the first artificial Earth satellite accesses into space. October 4, 1957 went down in history. The country, which had celebrated the 12th anniversary of the great victory in the Second World War, experienced a new triumph. Soviet space rocket placed an artificial satellite in orbit. People of Kuibyshev shared this triumph, as well as hopes for new grand achievements. They did not yet realize that their city would play a very special role in the new space history. That was Kuibyshev half a century ago, when a top-secret designer, Sergei Korolev from Moscow, visited it. In the so-called House of Industry, where the local economic council was situated, the regional party leaders and the legendary designer were discussing a revolutionary proposal: to organize serious production of intercontinental ballistic missile R-7 at the aircraft plant number 1, and its engines at the plant named after Frunze. The leading designer of Korolev's Design Bureau number 1, OKB-1, Dmitry Kozlov, came to Kuibyshev to organize the serious production of R-7.
И вот завод, который должен был освоить эту ракету, был выбран завод имени Сталина номер 1, Министерство авиационной.
The aircraft plant number 1, named after Stalin, was chosen for producing this missile. It was considered the best in the aircraft industry, so it was ascribed to this project. I was appointed the deputy to Korolev and was responsible for organizing the R-7 series production here in Kuibyshev.
И ответственным за внедрение ракеты Р-7 на заводе здесь, в Куйбышеве.
The arms race having started, the country needed a missile able to deliver a heavy nuclear warhead to long distances, and initially R-7 was created to fulfill this task. Korolev, who was used to working under maximum strain, demanded the same from his colleagues. The schedule was tight. There was just a year to reconstruct the production line and to produce 2 missiles. They were to be launched in the beginning of 1959.
Цех номер 12 сборочный самолетов был полностью срыт, можно сказать, с лица земли.
The former assembly shop number 12 was practically torn down. The floors were dismantled. Only the walls and the roof were left. They did not recognize that shop. It was like a surgical department, a very good surgical department. Now it would be called a complete refit. It took only 305 days, from March 28, 1958 to December 30, 1958, to prepare 2 R-7 missiles for delivery to Baikonur launching site. It was an absolute world record, the authors of which are the director of aircraft plant number 1, Viktor Litvinov, and the designer, Dmitry Kozlov.
И вот я 28-го приехал, еще кругом делалось самолеты. В сборочном цехе самолеты.
Here I came on March 28. Planes were being assembled in the shop, conveyor was functioning. And on December 30, I commissioned the 2 missiles produced by the plant as a leading designer and deputy chief designer. The chief himself was absent at the moment. The group of workers who escorted the first serial R-7 to the testing area was headed by Alexander Soldatenkov, who worked as a so-called chief launcher at the Baikonur launching site for over 40 years. Technical supervisor of launches is a special position. He was the only man to make decisions in the last hours, minutes and seconds before launching. There were quite a lot of such situations at that time. R-7 by Korolev did not immediately become a mass missile world famous for its reliability. This was the merit of rocket producers.
Вот чем я горжусь, это, собственно, даже не моя школа, но я...
Here is what I'm proud of. And this is not my school, but I adhere to it. It dates back to Korolev's time. Every remark was carefully studied, and all of them were written down to return to them at home. What was wrong, and why did it turn out so? Alexander Soldatenko retired not long ago, in 2005, when he was 78. His position was so special also because everyone engaged in space industry believes not only in engineering, but also in fortune. The hero of labor, Lenin Prize and other honorable awards winner, he had one more honorable, though informal title in Baikonur, the mascot man. That's the way I was wearing it. It was fashionable, a French style. It is one of the Baikonur legends. The people on the testing ground are superstitious, and they started to consider that the beret Soldatenkov was always wearing was a talisman, and either seriously or jokingly asked him not to come to testing ground without it. Today, a lot of museums are eager to have it as an exhibit. But then, very few people knew what Soldatenkov was engaged in progress plant. The industry was highly classified. Samara-based rocket makers got a lot of work to do and state awards, but very little fame. People got to know that Dmitry Kozlov was twice hero of labor, Lenin and state prize winner only in the 1980s.
Ну, сейчас страшно об этом говорить даже. Вот я был членом обкома. 20 с лишним лет членом обкома.
Well, it's terrible to talk about it now. I was a member of the Communist Party, regional committee, for 20 years, but I was never allowed either to make a speech or write a newspaper article. I even had to visit an exhibition in Paris as a professor of Kuibyshev Aircraft Engineering Institute. Few people knew that in the 60s, Korolov had been visiting Kuibyshev very often, once or twice a month. He usually stayed in the flats provided by the Communist Party Regional Committee, or at 2 Ulitsa Vilanovskaya, or in the so-called General's House in Kuibyshev Square, or in the first line of Summer Cottage Community, a special place for top executives. Grand projects at the secret plant required constant supervision by the chief designer. One of such projects was creating a reliable carrier rocket for the piloted space flights. R-7 was becoming a carrier for spacecrafts instead of being a strategic ballistic missile used for military purposes. Key to depressurization, key to depressurization. Depressurization began. Kedr, I'm Zarya number 1. Let's go. He said, let's go. In Russian, it sounds as Poyechali. These shots became world famous. But for a very long time, there was no information about Gagarin's return home. Cosmonaut number 1 was triumphantly welcomed in Moscow a bit later, on April 14, while the spacecraft Vostok had to land in the south of Kuibyshev region near Pestrovka village. In case of injuries, a special surgical room had been prepared for it in the local hospital. Actually, Vostok landed a bit further south, in Saratov region. Then Gagarin was taken to Kuibyshev, to the Progress Plant airfield, to get his first flowers and to give his first signatures. Then he spent 3 days and nights after the flight in the hotel complex in the Summer Cottage community. Everything has changed here, except the view of the Volga River from Gagarin's room. KGB man Viktor Streltsov was the head of the department in charge of security of Cosmonaut number 1 here in Kuibyshev.
Обсуждать тему полета Гагарина, как там космос, как Земля выглядела, было не разрешено, потому что потом уже сказано было, если он бы одному рассказал, как второму рассказал, то на заседании Государственной комиссии он бы мог еще фантазировать третьему, четвертому. В эту комнату его привели.
It was strictly prohibited to discuss Gagarin's flight in order not to break the secrecy and just to avoid speculations on how the Earth or the outer space looked like before the sitting of the State Committee.
Тогда в Куйбышеве. Ну, Гагарин, он выглядел, у него очень...
Gagarin was taken here and he spent 3 days in this room. He didn't look too tired, played billiards. Nevertheless, it was the order not to go to bed too late, to be in the good form of the meeting of the State Committee, which was to be held next morning. The veranda on the first floor, where a humble dinner was served for Gagarin on the day of his coming to Kuibyshev, was made a meeting room in the morning. It turned out to be quite small for all the members of that historical meeting, where about 90 people were present. They were the first to listen to Gagarin's story. He described all his feelings and impressions during the flight.
Доклад был рассчитан на час, так, наверное, приблизительно. Но он около часа докладывал, ну а потом посыпались вопросы. Вопросов, конечно, масса, но вопросы, я не помню, вел, наверное, Королев или Кабанин.
The report was to take about an hour, but there were lots of questions from the members of the committee, journalists and cosmonauts. The meeting was presided over by Korolev and lasted 3 hours.
Космонавты задавали вопросы. И, короче говоря, комиссия заседания продлилась около 3 часов.
The first 6 cosmonauts were brought here to Kuibyshev, to this hotel complex, after their flights. Here they were met by their space comrades and of course by Korolev himself. This is one of the rare photos where you can see Korolev. It was strictly prohibited to photograph him. Initially, the first and the second stages of the Vostok spacecraft were manufactured here in Kuibyshev, but shortly afterwards, the third stage was also produced here. So all the rockets for piloted flights, starting from the first one, were made here, by the Progress plant. And the workers never let the designer and the cosmonauts down. That is why Korolev decided to charge Kuibyshev rocket makers even a more audacious project. Soviet cosmonauts had to land the moon in 1967. These were the plans of the Soviet government. It would have meant a complete victory in the space race. Korolev got this task in 1961. There was practically no time to fulfill it. And the chief designer made the decision to remodel his long-standing dream, Martian spacecraft. It was decided to concentrate all the work on the lunar project in the Volga Lounge. It won't be an exaggeration to say that the whole region was working for the project. The Progress plant, the aircraft plant, the metallurgical plant, the plant named after Frunze, the metallist plant, the Ekran plant, the Salyut mechanical plant, the oxygen plant, the Tyazhmash and plastic plants in Syzran, and some other smaller companies were also involved. The main task was to create a principally new, more powerful and efficient engine for the lunar rocket. And here in Kuibyshev, Korolev had found an associate. On the advice of Tupolev, he turned to Nikolai Kuznetsov, chief designer of experimental plant producing military aircraft engines.
Королев здесь побывал в 1958 году, посмотрел цехи, посмотрел потенциал.
Korolev came here in 1958, had a look at the workshops, assessed the potential of Design Bureau, and suggested that Kuznetsov makes closed-circuit rocket engines. The production of such engines had hidden dangers. The process was so intense that it caused an explosion in the combustion chamber. It was a challenge, but the problems were solved successfully. The workers of SNTK Kuznetsov recall that while working on the production of lunar engine, they were changing their uniforms several times per shift. One had to wear a linen uniform for one operation, a silk for another. Only for some operations one could put a simple cotton uniform. Wearing gloves was obligatory. Cleanliness standards were very high. As the engines were intended to work in extreme conditions, they were tested severely. Even metal chips were inserted into them, and the engine's NK-33 stood the test very successfully. A special engine test bed was built for testing NK-33 out of town near the village of Vintai. Local people usually called it Himzavod, a chemical plant.
В то время был создан действительно двигатель будущего.
Oh yes, at that time a real engine of the future was created. This project first applied an aircraft principle. Every engine first passed bench tests confirming its serviceability, and only then it was installed in the rocket. So multiple-use principle was initially presupposed. This was a genius provision of Nikolai Kuznetsov. Height 105 meters, payload 95 tons, foundation diameter 17 meters, gigantic cyclopean construction. That was the lunar spacecraft number 1. Nowadays, the lunar spacecraft creation is often called a political project. The space race went on. At that time, the USA had already got new, more powerful engines for their Saturn, thrust about 700 tons. The Soviet project was not appropriately financed from the very start. Not all the tests were made before the first takeoff. We'll have to test the spacecraft during the flight, Korolev said. Actually, the first takeoffs were trial ones.
Конечно, вот при работе в такой спешке...
It's natural that quite a number of mistakes were made. People worked in a hurry. These mistakes were of course found out afterwards. The project was closed in 1974.
Если бы ее не остановить, а еще дать, вообще говоря...
Should the designers and workers have some more time to make improvements, the spacecraft would have been launched. But the man who could defend and further lead the project had died. Korolov's death in January 1966 finished the history of the lunar spacecraft.
Забил был колоссальный к этому моменту. Мне завод трубопровода уже наклепал там по 12...
Enormous groundwork had been done. The mechanical plant had produced pipelines for 12 items. Takeoff and medical units had been prepared at Syzran-based plants, and the aircraft plant had prepared the tank panels. Just take all that and use. Korolov also suggested modifying the project. It was quite easy to make another carrier, N2, on the basis of the lunar spacecraft. It would have been the same as N1, but without the first stage.
Вот эта ракета точно бы летала, и мы бы уже тогда, в конце 60-х, начале 70-х годов, имели бы чистый носитель, работающий на керосине.
The spacecraft could have been used for sure. And we could have already had a carrier with a thrust of 30 tons in the 70s. Take my word for it.
Могу ручаться.
But this suggestion was rejected. The work on N1 finished, and Viktor Kravchenko, the head of the Progress workshop in Baikonur, really had to bury the results of his long-time work.
Было указание.
The instruction was given to exterminate just everything. So the supply was cut by plasma, pressed by tractors, dug them into trenches in the desert. Kuznetsov experimental plant in Kuibyshev was given one more order, to exterminate all the engines for the lunar project. It has become a corporate legend. At the end of the staff meeting, where the fatal decision was made, Kuznetsov said, "It's not enough to have power. One also needs to have brains." And it was for the first time that a military man, General Kuznetsov, did not obey the order. The engines were not exterminated. They were hidden in a warehouse near the engine test bench in Vintai.
Менталитет, уровень мышления Королева и Кузнецова. Почему они сблизились, два великих человека? Они всегда смотрели в будущее. И вот
Korolov and Kuznetsov had the same mentality. That's why these two great men became friends and shared the same views. They both had the talent of vision. They looked into the future. And the corporate and state interests were very important for them. It was quite natural for Kuznetsov to save the engines, which were to be exterminated. It was not because of his personal offense or ambitions, not for revenge. He understood that the result of his design bureau work was not his private property, but the state property, and it should have been preserved. And this risk has been justified. It's now planned to equip the new Russian spacecraft Soyuz 2-3 with these engines. Practically at the same time, the N1 project was initiated. The work began on the series production of a new secret unit, an artificial Earth satellite.
опытный завод ОКБ-1, опытный завод Сергея Павловича Королева, он по замыслам Королева должен был заниматься более сложными пилотируемыми кораблями, станциями для полета на Марс, Венеру. И, конечно, он не в состоянии был изготавливать по 15, 16, 18 спутников в год. А завод...
The experimental plant Korolev OKB-1 had to work on more complicated piloted spacecrafts and stations for flights to Mars and Venus. They could not afford making 15, 16 or 18 satellites a year. And our plant showed itself to advantage, and it was no risky for Korolev to hand over the series production of satellites to Progress plant.
Передавать серийное изготовление этих космических аппаратов на...
According to documents of Moscow Design Bureau, the first satellite of such type, Zenit, was assembled when Korolev was still alive. The veterans of Progress plant can't help smiling when they recall the imperfection of the first satellites.
Пленка снималась, потом возвращалась пленка на Землю. Самые первые аппараты были еще сложнее. Пленка снималась, проявлялась на борту, закреплялась на борту, естественно, проявитель-закрепитель, потом сканировалась телевизионным передатчиком, там был телевизионный передатчик, и уже телевизионный передатчик передавал на Землю.
The first crafts were very sophisticated. The film was to be shot, developed and fixed on board, scanned to a TV transmitter, and only then transmitted to the Earth. The quality was awful, of course, and it was very difficult to organize developing and fixing the film on board. Something was constantly dropping and leaking there. Jokingly, it was even called a laundry. Soon a more simple decision was made: to develop negatives on the Earth and give the films to consumers. At the same time, it was a real breakthrough. It became possible to start arms reduction talks, as there appeared a means of control over the compliance with the terms of agreement by the counterparts. Besides, the satellites of the next generation, called Yantar, 100% in-house designed by Kuybyshev Central Design Bureau, CSKB, was much more perfect.
Мы взяли, поставили во главу звена одну цифровую вычислительную машину. И все на нее посадили. Машина, это была первая цифровая вычислительная машина вообще на борту космического аппарата в Советском Союзе. И мы на эту машину положили все управление. Начиная от отделения от ракетоносителя до посадки, все делала эта машина, управляла всем. И нас все ругали, как же вот так, хотя машина была там дублирована.
We just developed it on the basis of a digital computing machine. It was the first computer on board a spacecraft in the Soviet Union. This equipment was in charge of everything, starting from separation from the spacecraft and up to landing. And even though the system was duplicated, they said, "How come? It's impossible, it's too risky." But we were young, ambitious and not afraid of authorities. And we made that satellite Yantar 2K, which became a basis of a number of satellites of that type.
И он послужил основой для целой плеяды спутников подобного класса.
Progress had manufactured about 700 such units. One of them is exhibited in the Machinery Museum in Tольятти. Kuybyshev-based rocket makers did not keep out of the last but not least major space project, called Energia Buran. The first Soviet reusable spacecraft was to become an alternative to the American shuttle and to overcome it in a number of criteria. The project was drawn up in Moscow, in RKK Energia. It was a nationwide corporation, but its central division, the Volga branch, was in Kuybyshev. It was in charge of working out the documentation for all the plants engaged in manufacturing the shuttle.
Главным в нашей работе оказалась разработка центрального кислородно-водородного блока, который был по силам и по возможностям изготовления только лишь здесь.
We were mainly engaged in working out the central oxygen-hydrogen unit, able to be produced only here locally. There has been not a single place in our country where there was enough productive capacity to work with rocket constructions up to 10 meters in diameter. There were no more such premises, test benches and direct access to airfields. This is a unique place designed for executing the full range of works on this project. Final assembly of Energia had to take place in Baikonur, but previously it had been necessary to solve thousands of very complicated technical problems. New materials, new technologies, new designs. Many things had never been made before anywhere in the world. Even the way of delivering tanks to Baikonur had to be invented. There was simply no transport means in the Soviet Union able to carry such gigantic load. Alexander Kirillin is now General Director of CSKB Progress. At that time, he was the foreman of the shop that produced pipelines for the central airframe of Energia. The objective was clear. There should be no test flights. This meant that every system was to be tested and worked out very thoroughly. At the same time, there were constant orders of high-ranking executives to accelerate the work.
Конечно, мы работали очень напряженно, практически работали круглосуточно.
Of course, we worked in a rush, practically for 24 hours a day. I should say the tension was so high that the workers on the Baikonur space launching site did not leave their workplaces for 2 or 3 days. And the first takeoff of the new shuttle Energia, without Buran yet, in 1987, became triumphant.
Вот там сидят, знаете, министры, значит, там, главнокомандующий космическими силами, там, генерал Максимов там принадлежал. И вот, когда ракета оторвалась и улетела, вот это дикий такой всплеск этих эмоций, я просто сам не заметил, как мы все оказались на столах. Вот как я мог...
There were, you know, the ministers, Space Forces Commander-in-Chief General Maximov, he was present too. And when the shuttle took off and flew away, there was such a joy. I don't remember how, but everybody was jumping on the tables. How could we do it? Just impossible. And that was the moment of real happiness.
Вот этот миг счастья.
And in 1988, there was a successful launching of the new Soviet space shuttle Buran. It was not yet piloted, but the variant of piloted flight was also being worked out. Test pilot Sergei Tresvyatsky is better known as the general director of SNTK Kuznetsov. He is one of the members of the crew of test cosmonauts in Energia Buran program. The most difficult operation was to land the shuttle, and it was being tested in flying laboratories.
Вот эти были комплексные ориентировки. Представлялось, как будто мы запускаем Буран. Включалась циклограмма, времени отсчет.
These were complex trainings. We switched on the timing diagram as if Buran was being launched, then launched Buran, reached the orbit, made a full orbit around the Earth, and started descending. At that moment, we were taking off and had to reach that point in space. At the same time, all the systems on the Earth were working, the central flight control unit was working, and in general, all the systems responsible for the flight control throughout the world were operating as well. The task was very important, and we were flying in the automatic mode, reached that point from 10 kilometers distance, great accuracy was required, switched on automatic mode, and performed that trajectory. But the piloted flight did not take place. Creation of the most powerful shuttle coincided with the start of perestroika. The arms race and space race were stopped. Nobody knew what was going to happen not only with the space industry, but also with the country as a whole. The main reason to reject continuing the program was its cost. 15 billion rubles had been spent just for manufacturing Energia carrier rocket without Buran spacecraft. Simultaneously with the global project Energia, Samara-based Progress plant continued the series production of Soyuz carriers and space satellites. Korolyov's R-7 is still the most mass-produced and reliable missile which is still in demand. Zvyozny Gorodok near Moscow, Russian cosmonauts training center and residential area. Cosmonauts of the new generation are training here on the space simulator Soyuz, very similar to that historical Gagarin spacecraft. Carrier rockets for it are made by the Progress plant. Maxim Surayev is just going to take part in a space expedition. He is now working out one of the most difficult operations, manual docking and joining of the craft with the space station.
На углы транспортного корабля по курсу 1,1 градуса, потом вяжу, также 1,1.
Angles for the transport shape, 1/10 grade, DOS angles, 1/10 grade, mutual heel made up 1/10 of a degree, mark for tangency parameters is excellent. There are many people from Samara among cosmonauts of all generations. Those who live in the village of Gvardeity, Borsky district, are proud of their countryman Alexei Gubarev. There is a museum in the village where the documents and photos are exhibited, and there is a monument in his honor in the central square. He was the first commander of international crew during the flight in the framework of Intercosmos program. He was twice in space, having made the longest ever journey for the sake of his motherland's fame, but he never forgets his native village.
Я в душе самарский, я родился на...
Samara is a part of my soul. I was born on the river Samara, the purest one indeed, and my house was 1.5 kilometers from it. Alexei Gobarev says he was dreaming about the sky from his early childhood. He was a squadron commander when he was made an offer to join a space crew, and he hesitated just for 5 minutes.
Написал рапорт, что готов.
He reported of his readiness to become a cosmonaut and apply all his knowledge, experience, and even give his life should it be required. Mr. Gobarev has a profound respect for Samara rocket makers, as he twice had a chance to estimate their work.
Космические полеты показали о ее надежности. А это самое главное.
Space flights proved the reliability of this rocket. And this is the most vital. I'd say I haven't heard of any case of this rocket's malfunction. And if a rocket works well, why should we reject it? For the last 50 years, a unique space complex was formed in Samara. It is the only one in Russia, and one out of the very few in the world, where piloted spacecrafts are being produced. This complex includes Progress Plant and a lot of other companies cooperating with it. Metallist, Metallurgical Plant, Motorstроитель, Plastic in Sizran, and Samara State Aerospace University, which prepares staff for space industry. It is one of the 17 higher institutions of education in Russia which has won the competition on the best innovation project within the framework of National Project Education.
А какие еще есть перед человечеством сверхзадачи, кроме как освоение космического пространства? Ну, если посмотреть, где работают наши выпускники, то они работают по всему раньше Союзу.
What task the humankind had ever faced is more global than conquering space. Our graduates work all over Russia and the former USSR. They are being invited to work for NASA and Boeing, and no re-examining is needed. Our diplomas are valid everywhere. Science research of Samara State Aerospace University is known all over the world. Practically all the heads of companies engaged in space industry are the graduates of this university. The governor of Samara region, Mr. Konstantin Titov, got his first degree in it. At that time it was called the Aircraft Engineering Institute.
Но первое, я этим очень горжусь, и я надеюсь, что все самарцы гордятся. А все-таки Самарская область – это родина пилотируемой космонавтики. Мы с вами лидеры. На ракете, собранной на прогрессе.
Well, I'm proud, and I hope all our countrymen are proud that Samara is the motherland of piloted space flights. Yuri Gagarin made his first flight on board of R-7, which had been assembled by the Progress Plant. It was a euphoria of the whole country that we were the first in space, the first satellite, the first man in space, and that all was ours. And of course, the main thing for me was the flight of German Titov, my namesake. I had no doubt where to study at that time. I did not hesitate to send my documents to the Entrance Commission of Aircraft Engineering Institute. Samara State Aerospace University is not a sexual institution anymore. Today it is often called a university of high technologies, but it continues teaching how to design and to build rockets, test reliability of spacecraft engines, create new satellites. CSKB Progress has the right to be named a center of Samara Rocket and Space Complex. It is still building piloted spacecrafts and space vehicles. Formerly, these were mainly satellites for military reconnaissance. Now they are being used for peaceful purposes. Satellite for Earth sounding, resource decay, is known as the best among the satellites of such type in the world.
С высоты 630 километров, на котором он сейчас летает, виден предмет размером не менее 1 метра.
From the height of 630 meters, a subject with a size of 1 meter can be seen. A 3-meter car can be seen perfectly, and all the buildings, trees and bushes. This could be called the most unique resolution characteristics of a satellite. Besides sounding satellites, Samara-based companies produce units for scientific research in space. Artificial Earth satellite Photon is called a real orbital laboratory. Unlike piloted spacecrafts, where there is some gravitation background, Photon has a very low level of gravitation. This is why you can produce rare medicines, unusual materials, and carry out unique scientific experiments on board the Photon in conditions of practically zero gravitation.
И при уровне гравитации 10⁻⁵, 10⁻⁷ возникают совершенно уникальные вещи.
When the level of gravitation is from 10⁻⁵ to 10⁻⁷ degree, mysterious things happen. Crystals change their structure. Biological substances also change. New qualities are obtained, which are impossible to create on the Earth. You can get substances which can be used to cure cancer, AIDS, and so on. But it was by no means the serious production of Soyuz carrier rockets that made Progress Plant well known all over the world. It is one of the core businesses of this company, despite all its other global projects. Today we have designed a carrier with a reliability ratio up to 0.997. It means that 3 rockets out of 1,000 can have defects. According to the recent statistics, 50% of all launches are based on Russian rockets. Half of them are produced in Samara-based Design Bureau Progress.
Основным нашим конкурентным преимуществом по нашему носителю среднего класса является надежность. Нет ни одной ракеты в мире на сегодня, которая бы осуществила более 1700 запусков. Поэтому, конечно, и это...
One of our competitive advantages is reliability of our medium-class carriers. There is no other rocket in the world which has carried out more than 1,700 launches, so all piloted flights are made using our carriers and American shuttles. There is also a Chinese project which follows in our footsteps. For 50 years, R7 was upgraded 9 times. All systems of control now work on the basis of on-board digital computers. The new generation of R7, Soyuz 21A and Soyuz 21B, are now being launched to the orbit.
Ракет-носитель «Союз-2» это не последняя модификация. Мы сегодня работаем над ракетой-носителем «Союз-2-3». Это большей грузоподъемности. Если мы говорим, что мы на «Союзе-2» достигнем...
Soyuz 2 is not the latest modification. Currently, we are working on the carrier Soyuz 2-3. Soyuz 2-1 had load carrying capacity of maximum 8 tons, while Soyuz 2-3 is going to have load carrying capacity of 11, 13 and 15 tons of payloads. It is unlikely that in the nearest 10 or 15 years there will appear a carrier to compete with our Soyuz in reliability. R7 plays a special role in the history of conquering space. The first spacecraft which carried a man to near-Earth orbits is the only spacecraft in Russia and one out of the very few ones in the world intended for piloted flights. And it is always in demand for commercial launching. So space history of Samara is to be continued.